Hi, everyone, and welcome to FedTalks. I am so thrilled to be here today with Amir Khosrowshahi, who is not only one of the smartest people I know, but we also went to elementary school together. And we have one other trait in common. We both tend to be adrenaline junkies. He is a surfer, a skier, a mountain biker, and he does everything he touches, he sort of does to perfection. Amongst his many accomplishments, he has not only math and physics degree, but a PhD in computational neuroscience, which led him to build the first AI chipset with his company Nirvana, which Intel ended up buying. So Amir, welcome. And I want to start there. Tell us about computational neuroscience, how it relates to AI, and how it relates to what you did with Nirvana.
First, Niloofar, I'm very happy to be here. I'll give you a little bit of background on the field of computational neuroscience. So it started at the early part of this century with Ramon Cajal, who made this very basic identification that neurons in your brain are the basic unit of computation. And then from there the field evolved, and it's intertwined with the history of AI and the building of actual computers till today. And the basic idea is to understand the computational principles with which your brain operates. Recently, computational neuroscience has become the source of the AI renaissance that we are experiencing today, that many of the ideas and many of the people who are involved as AI leaders today have some background in computational neuroscience.
So as you're studying the human brain, and as we think about a future where we actually get to either general, intelligence or super artificial intelligence, how does it work with biological brains versus the computational brain? Where are we?
So the computational properties of the brain are still largely unknown. So it is actually one of the reasons why I went into silicon is that it's easier in some sense. But neurons in the brain operate using electrical signals that are transmitted along kind of tissues that are myelinated, and the architecture is massively parallel. And if you look at it, it seems almost intractable to figure out what it's doing. Whereas in the semiconductor world, all our computers are built with a fundamental concept of using electrons and photons even today in crystal lattices. So semiconductors are made out of silicon, and you basically manipulate electrons in the silicon to do simple computations. They're very unlike each other in many ways, but there are also some similarities that suggest areas for improvements on understanding neuroscience as well as improving our computers.
You specifically studied visual computational neuroscience, is that right?
That's right.
And this whole issue of how we see and how a computer sees seems to be an intractable problem that we haven't quite solved yet. What's it going to take before the computer can be as good as, the human brain is?
So the current state of the art in AI or neural networks is what's called a convolutional neural net. And what it does is it takes a camera image or a sequence of image or video, and it passes it through a series of computations or artificial neurons. And at the output of this network processing, it outputs, is it a cat? Is it a dog? Is it a stop sign? Is it a pedestrian? And so forth. The brain, the visual system in the brain occupies the back third of your head, and your eye and your retina is actually part of your brain. And the processing of the two systems is wildly unlike each other. However, in the field of AI today, there's a common misperception that they are largely similar. So I don't know how much detail we should go into. However, the visual systems that we're building today are successful, but they're a small step towards biological vision. So mammalian vision, we can do things like scene understanding, we can plan, we're able to assess ambiguous situations very well. So if things are obscured or occluded or uncertain, we are much better than current computational systems, convolutional neural networks.
So talk a little about Nirvana. What led you to start Nirvana, which I think you sold to Intel within 18 months. Is that right? For
About 2 years.
2 years.
That's right.
A really good exit. Congratulations on that. But what I'd love to know
Thank
is
you.
what led to creating Nirvana, and then we can get to what's next.
Well, so the field of AI has had many ups and downs, and the recent up started in 2006. And I was very lucky to be in at Berkeley in a lab where many of the luminaries, current luminaries of the field, Jeff Hinton, Jan LeCun, Yoshua Bengio, and Andrew Ng, they were all kind of around me and the other students, very frustrated. None of their papers were getting accepted. They were getting made fun of because they were using neural networks, and neural networks were dumb, and some other stuff was cooler. And at that time, I actually did not like deep learning um, um, as well, and I still have reservations that there's severe limitations. However, while I was immersed in this environment, I realized that I'm programming GPUs to do the computations for these networks. I realized that the computers and processors that we had were wildly inaccurate, wildly inefficient and inappropriate for the types of computations that predominate in these neural networks, multiplies and adds and nonlinearities. So I had in the back of my mind that at some point we would have to build specialized silicon to address this emerging workload. I did not anticipate that deep learning would blow up the way it did. That was quite surprising. And so the company itself, the founding and the acquisition by Intel kind of fell in our lap. It was just good timing.
So the history, I mean, as you mentioned, the history of artificial intelligence and the history of computing have been intertwined since the very beginning. Just give us like the 1-minute masterclass in the intersection of computing and AI.
Well, so it's very easy since it hasn't changed since the 1930s. I'm actually working on a problem that was stated by someone in the 1930s. So the fathers of our field were Alan Turing and John von Neumann. And Alan Turing and John von Neumann were the first people among a small group of people that were thinking about what are the things that you can compute. And at the same time, they were both building our first computers. So Alan Turing famously worked at Bletchley Park and decoded wartime messages. And John von Neumann built the first computers. So he built a computer that had an architecture, the von Neumann architecture, which is still the computers that we have today. So the two these themes of what can you compute and what are the computers to build is still what I'm working on, with an added wrinkle that John von Neumann at the end of his life started to think about the computers he had built, and he was just learning about recent results in neuroscience, and he was looking at the brain, and he prepared this a series of lectures that he wanted to present at Yale. Unfortunately, he passed away, and it was published posthumously, The Computer and the Brain, where he asked basic questions on why are mammalian brains or brains in general so different than the computers he just built. And just one theme from his writing or his thoughts that I'm still working on is how do you do precise computation with imprecise elements? So neurons are imprecise in some sense. However, the brain is very precise. So that is what I'm working on today. How do you build silicon substrates, computational circuits that have imprecise elements that can do precise computation? That's a short history.
So what does that look? What's the product that comes out of this?
So we talked about Nirvana. Nirvana built a processor specifically for artificial intelligence. If you start zooming in on what that actually means, at the very bottom is silicon. It's a physical set of atoms, and it's electrons and photons moving through these lattices. So this is an idiosyncratic narrative that I have that I don't think people talk about as it's too nerdy. But basically, that substrate is built out of CMOS, so complementary metal oxide semiconductor. That that substrate over the past 50 years has been optimized to crazy extremes, and Intel has played a large role in that optimization. It's one of the most significant technological trends of our civilization. So making transistors smaller and smaller and smaller, putting more of them on chips, Moore's law, and making them more energy efficient and so forth. These transistors are basically switches, and this amazing history is coming to an end. That there are limits to CMOS that I don't know if it's going to be in 5 years, 10 years, but it's going to happen. So what I'm working on is on the next generation of switches and circuits using room temperature quantum materials to replace CMOS, which is a really daunting task. And with this new technology, if we are actually successful, is what I'm working on at Intel currently, then we will be able to replace the basic elements and have many possible futures that I think the future for AI is going to be driven from this part of the space. Again, a controversial view.
I think what you're saying is for us to get to the place we want to get to with AI, with whether it's general or super, we've got to reimagine what the computer looks like down to its most basic components, because what we've relied on in the past is simply not going to scale looking forward to the future.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. That you're going to hit some limits unless you do basic innovation. So in some sense, I am very happy about the hype around AI, as it's basically funding this very difficult and risky research in new materials. So I am more interested in computation more generally and less in AI and neural networks. So hopefully all the interest in AI will actually drive innovation in this very difficult part of the stack of AI, hardware, software, algorithms, and all sorts of other things that it entails.
I love it because you're an adrenaline junkie for tech as much as you are for life and applying that
I see.
same risk embracing philosophy, which is what it's going to take. So look forward 50 years. What is, what's the world going to look like? What's the, what are the most exciting inventions or what could be, what can't we imagine today? Which is, I mean, that's an unfair question, but go
It's
at it.
very unfair. So I guess I will just wildly speculate. And I think if you look to science fiction as the best guide, I think we will be building, hopefully, organisms or entities not from organic material. That we will be building embodied computers, you can call them robots, that have wildly different properties than biological entities, that they will be able to do things that are far beyond our intelligence. So 50 years, I would just assume that's an arbitrary date.
Yes.
Maybe this will take 200 years, but I think with all the craziness going on around us, we are realizing that our attention and our mental, I feel like I'm hitting some limit on my brain capacity. And I look forward to either not being replaced, but being augmented by something else. And that's to be seen. And I think it's definitely going to happen within 100, 200 years. We're going to have different entities roaming the earth. That is as wild a speculation I'll ever do.
Okay, so when those super AI robots are roaming the earth, is it the end of humanity or is it a better humanity?
I have no idea. I always joke that being a biologist, the basic organisms like spiders and flies just seem incredible to me. That the technology and the engineering is just remarkable, otherworldly. So I'm already totally amazed by the things around me, and just it's very hard to extrapolate. Just I think I'm still trying to wrap my head around very basic organisms that have evolved over the last 4 billion years. And then we're going to be doing our own optimizations and creating our own organisms in the future. It's very hard to know. I'm still grappling with the present.
So in that, and so how do we make sure that we don't make the same mistakes we've made in the past in terms of making assumptions about technology and how it's going to be used, and ensure that we stay on, path of goodness?
So that's a great question. So in the past 5 years, I've witnessed a lot of people like myself, engineers and scientists, becoming more and more cognizant of the social implications of the technology we're building. So we're always wary and concerned about misuse of technology. However, this recent past couple of years have been particularly difficult for me, as I can give you one example. There is a movie out called The Social Dilemma out on Netflix. I highly recommend to everyone. I was at a dinner with Tristan Harris, who you know, and Roger McNamee. They were sitting on either sides of me. Roger was talking about how Facebook is causing so much trouble, and he wrote a book called Zucked. And Tristan has been speaking very eloquently about the problems with social media. And I frankly thought they were wildly sensational. So that was a very big mistake. They were actually right on. And over the last 2 years, I've started to talk to individuals like yourself to understand these issues. It's quite removed from crystal lattices and electrons. So, and I would actually like to know your thoughts on this really pressing challenge. That how is, for example, social media, which leverages AI to a large extent on large supercomputers with tons of data, what are the actual problems and what should we do about it?
Well, thank you for that question.
That's the same as a 50-year question. That's just as hard.
It's a hard question. I mean, here's what's interesting. Everything you're doing is going to accelerate innovation, right? Human beings used to have all this time to adapt to innovation and new technologies. We don't. I mean, today we have 3 simultaneous revolutions going on with genetics, engineering, and the AI revolution. So if we get off the right track, it's really hard to course correct. And this is where we have to be really purposeful about making sure that we don't get off the right track and think about these things the right way. And the moment we discover, my perspective, the moment we discover that there is a bad use for technology, we've got to wrap our arms around it. I thought Social Dilemma was fantastic. I'm a huge fan of Tristan Harris, and I've read Zucked. The way he talks about it, I think it's a public health crisis. And the answer is no different than any other public health crisis we've had, whether it's tobacco or AIDS. It starts with education. You have to have an informed public that understands how this supercomputer that's aimed at your brain actually functions, so that you can start protecting yourself against it. The second part of it is you can't target advertising at children. That was the tobacco lesson. We've got to protect the kids while their brains are developing. And the third is you got to tax bad usage. So the business model with respect to social media, I think, is broken. And we have to move away from an advertising model to a fee-based model. And if you can treat it like a public health hazard, you can get your arms around it. But what you're absolutely right about is I don't think anyone really predicted how this technology was going to be abused. Because everyone who was creating it had the best intentions in mind. But we also aren't agile as a society to respond fast enough. And that's where we've got to get much better. And as you become successful and keep inventing these things that make computers better and faster and enable AI, we as a society have got to get much better at being agile in how we respond to it and protect people from the downside of all that technology. I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but it's the best. It's the best I have right now.
So we can work together as technologists, and it entails every possible skill to address this challenge. It's definitely not an algorithm challenge. It's not a devices, or it won't come out of the startup space. It's it's one of our grand challenges, and it will require every possible skill. I'm
I,
still at the early stages myself.
yeah, I agree with you. It's a whole of society response, and everyone has an obligation, from the technologist to the consumer, to play their part to make sure tech is used for good. Amir, we're at our time. This is bucket list for me to be able to have a conversation with you. I'm so excited to see what you do next and what your next company is, and how you continue disrupting the field of AI and computing. And thank you so much for coming. Thank you everyone for being here, and enjoy the rest of FedTalks.
Thank you, Nilu.